So, Aloysia Brooks, thank you for joining WACA today. I was hoping you could start by just describing the kind of work that you're focused on.
My work is primarily around torture prevention. I've been a human rights activist and advocate for a number of years now, particularly around trying to have federally enshrined human rights protections enacted in Australia. So the Justice Campaign was started as a group of concerned individuals who were really worried about the way that the Australian government handled David Hicks's case. Of course, there's a great torture element to that because we have obligations under the Convention Against Torture to independently and thoroughly investigate credible allegations of torture. Now, that never happened in David's case, and although he was under US jurisdiction, Australia still had an obligation to ensure that he was being treated humanely, considering that John Howard had come out at the time and said, well, I could bring him home anytime if I wanted to, but I choose not to. Also, we're calling on the Australian government to hold an independent and open investigation into the political interference and David's treatment while he was over there.
Is the inquiry that you're seeking into the US's behaviour or into Australia's involvement in that process?
Yeah, so it's really around the Australian government's knowledge of what was happening to David at the time. So we want to know, as democratic citizens do, what the Australian government knew, whether they knew that he was being tortured at the time, what they were going to do about it, and whether there was political interference in his eventual plea deal. Now, we already know that there was, but we want to know the extent to which they knew and the extent to which they participated in the actions of the United States.
During David's ordeal, there was a wide range of public opinion about what had led him to be in the situation he was in and the kind of treatment that he was receiving at the hands of the US. Are you able to speak about, from David's perspective, how he ended up in Guantanamo Bay?
So I don't speak for David, but he clearly sets out in his book what he was doing overseas at the time, and it all centres around Kashmir, which is very rarely reported in the mainstream media. I think a lot of media opinion can be attributed to the fact that he couldn't speak for himself for all of those years. So we have 10 years now of rubbish that has been reported and repeated over and over again. So there wasn't anyone who actually could speak to David to relay the story because he was being held in incommunicado detention and all of his letters and communications were monitored. So we have to remember that when we go to Wikipedia and think that we're getting an accurate portrayal of his story, there actually isn't one. It's one of the most misreported stories of all time, I think.
Guantanamo in itself seems to be a purposely built torture facility. And in fact, Obama came into his presidency in the United States vowing to close down this torture facility. So are you able to give just a little bit more insight from the Justice Campaign's perspective on what is going on at Guantanamo and why is it still open? And how do we go about, as a global society, reconciling what is happening there with our own sense of democracy and human rights?
Yeah, well, I think I'll start off by talking a bit about Adnan Latif, who was a detainee who passed away last month. So there are now 166 men still in Guantanamo. Many of them have been held there for over 10 years now without charge or trial. This is a significant stain on the Obama administration. As you said, he did promise to close it. However, this hasn't been followed through, and you can only surmise that that's because of the political pressure that he's come under. And Congress has also made it very difficult for Obama. They've passed a series of laws that have made it impossible for anyone who's detained in Guantanamo to be transferred to the mainland. they are not able to have trials in federal courts. So we've actually taken 10 steps backwards. A lot of the techniques that are used in Guantanamo are psychologically based torture techniques. Now, these have not been just pulled out of the sky. They've been used for a number of years and unfortunately perfected over a number of years. A lot of the interrogators were trained in what are called SEER training techniques. So that is survival, evasion, resistance, escape. And that's the same techniques that are provided to US military personnel who are, quote, captured by a dishonourable enemy. So it's the training is supposed to help them to withstand torture techniques. So a lot of the techniques are around sensory deprivation, isolation, could be bombardment, sensory bombardment as in 24-hour lighting. So these are a lot of the techniques that David experienced, and the men who are still there would be experiencing them right now as we speak, unfortunately. Militaries go by what's called prolonging the shock of capture. So what they do is to try and draw out the psychological shock of when you've first been detained. So they hood people, they put goggles over their eyes, they put earmuffs on them, the shackles, so that people don't know where they are, what time of day it is. They can't reach the outside world. Now, because of this, David was taken to 2 offshore locations after he was rendered to 2 US military ships called the USS Peleliu and USS Bataan. He had some serious beatings whilst he was detained on transit to Guantanamo. We've seen in the medical records that he had a double hernia and bleeding from his ears, and we can only surmise that it's because of the injections and pills that he was being given at the time. A lot of the detainees have spoken about receiving the same sort of injections where they've had hallucinogenic experiences, where they become depressed and have psychotic sort of episodes. So that's really concerning. The sensory deprivation and isolation are particularly troubling for people who are confined. You can have long-term consequences of that. You have hallucinations, auditory and visual, and you lose your cognitive and emotional faculties as well. There were plenty of cold rooms, so they'd leave people just with shorts on in a room. The lights would be left on 24 hours a day. There was sensory bombardment in that they'd have music playing or loud sounds, whether that be croaking frogs or chainsaw engines. So the whole point of Guantanamo was to break people down mentally, to make it a horrific place to be, and to break the mind so that people would sign false confessions, which they all did. The camp in Guantanamo called Camp No, as in no, it does not exist. And that's where apparently the 3 men who supposedly suicided in 2006, apparently they were interrogated there and killed there because they were found hanging in their cells, but they had rags shoved down their throats. They were bound by their hands and ankles. By the time the families got the bodies, the larynx was removed, all of the major organs were removed so that they couldn't perform an independent autopsy. So this man who died last month, I have really grave concerns about how he died. I mean, I know that he had significant mental health issues, as you would after 10 years of horror and hell, but we will never know how some of these men died because of the way that they return the bodies to the families. There's just no respect and no dignity for those men. Once a person has been tortured, there is no way of ever living a normal life again. You can have all of the therapy and counselling in the world, but the purpose of torture is to destroy the person. It is about breaking someone down to the point where they have no personality of their own anymore. Their will is broken and they do whatever their captors want them to do. So unfortunately, that's why the psychological techniques are used, because even just isolation on its own can cause severe hallucinations and cognitive and emotional problems that are there for a lifetime. You will never live a normal life again.
So you have to ask yourself, well, what is the purpose beyond absolutely breaking the will and the spirit of that individual? And why is a country like America, our ally, engaging in such behaviour?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there was a panic after 9/11. There was widespread fear, and fear is a very powerful tool. We've seen it in many different contexts around the globe, that when the population is fearful, that means that the government enacts prohibitions on civil liberties that wouldn't normally be acceptable. So I think at the beginning it was all about, well, we need to show the population that we're doing something about it, we're going to find these bad guys. But when they realised that the majority of men that they had captured weren't going to give them anything because they were shepherds or shopkeepers, they panicked. So they ended up torturing them and getting false confessions, which unfortunately has meant that a lot of innocent human beings have been locked away in Guantanamo for a number of years.
In those early days of, the invasion of Afghanistan, and when people were being rounded up, so to speak, and I know the Northern Alliance were being paid by America to hand people over, there are other countries around the globe that immediately demanded that their citizens be repatriated back to their countries rather than be held in Guantanamo. Did the Australian government attempt to do anything like that for David?
Back to the rewards for the Northern Alliance from the US. So David was one of the people who was sold to the United States. So David was at a taxi stand when the Northern Alliance apprehended him. He was actually on his way home to Australia at the time. He wasn't fighting against US troops, which is a common misconception put out there. So he was one of the people who was sold during that earlier period. So David actually applied for British citizenship while he was in Guantanamo, because they realised that the Australian government was not going to assist him in getting out of Guantanamo, but the Brits were all brought home. So Julian Assange is not the first person to seek help from another country because the Australian government wasn't protecting his human rights. So it was unfortunately unsuccessful. He did get his British citizenship because of his mother was born in England, but it was revoked on the same day. So he was then left in Guantanamo without any human rights.
There's a common perception that David pled guilty to terrorist charges from the United States, and that's why he was eventually allowed to be repatriated back to Australia, etc. Is that true? Because the information that I've read suggests that that's not what happened.
Yeah. So David pled what's called the Alford Plea, which means that you don't accept any, it's no admission of guilt. So he was not at any time saying, yes, I support terrorism. So that's completely false. he had a piece of paper shoved in front of his face after 5.5 years of horror and torture, saying, "You will be home in 60 days if you sign this." So he signed it. But it was not an admission of guilt. So that's been one of the things that the Australian media is only starting to come around now and start reporting. And in the recent proceeds case against David, none of the plea agreement and none of the evidence that the government submitted could be used in a court because it was all obtained in Guantanamo under duress.
I wanted to talk about that. So David wrote a book, and then the government decided that they didn't want him receiving the proceeds of that book and decided to take him to court over it. And then all of a sudden at the 11th hour, the government dropped this court case. What went on there? Why do you think they so doggedly pursued that and then suddenly dropped the case?
The Australian government dropped the case for a number of reasons. Firstly, because, as they said in their statement, there was insufficient evidence, which is pretty startling considering that they left him in Guantanamo for 5.5 years. Then he was under a gag order, and then he was under a control order. So, we have to question the time that he spent imprisoned if there was insufficient evidence of a crime being committed. That's the first part. The second reason why I think that they dropped the case was embarrassment, because if you actually look through the evidence they submitted, as saying that he was never mistreated, it would be embarrassing for a court to read his medical records, for example, where they have redacted medications that were given to him. There were a heap of injections, including a drug called mefloquine, which is known to produce psychotic and hallucinogenic side effects, including suicide ideation, anxiety and depression. So there were a lot of embarrassing revelations in the documents that would have been tabled by the court. You also had the testimony of Brandon Neely, who was a guard at Guantanamo, who was going to come and give testimony to what he saw David being put through. Another interesting part of evidence was going to be the NCIS report that was ordered by Wolfowitz at the time. And I can't go into detail of what's in that report, but there are significant admissions made by people who were there at the time that back up his story about his beatings on transit to Guantanamo. So even before he got to Guantanamo, there is evidence that he endured 8 to 10 hour beatings, that he was photographed naked, bleeding and shackled, and that he was subjected to conditions that clearly violate the Convention Against Torture.
And do you think that the Australian government knew about this?
Well, we know from David's book that Australian officials identified him while he was on the 2 ships. So he was taken to 2 ships before he was even brought to Guantanamo. So we know that Australian officials knew that he was being held there, but we need an investigation to find out the extent to which they knew of his mistreatment at the time. We need to know whether they had those photos of him. This is akin to what came out in Abu Ghraib. Yes. So it's very serious. It's serious to think that the Australian government would ignore the torture of one of its citizens, or 2 of its citizens at the time, because of political alliances. That's just not okay, and that's why we need human rights protections and why we need an investigation. David is terrified for Julian Assange right now. He knows what the United States government is capable of. He also knows what little the Australian government did for him. He knows what the definition of consular assistance means, and he talks a lot when he speaks. He spoke publicly for Julian around a time when the consular official came to see him in Guantanamo, and he was pointing out stains on the carpet from where he had to relieve himself because he'd been left chained to the floor for so many hours. David is very scared for Julian Assange, and I think we all need to be. I think that it's a very, very serious position that he's in now, especially considering that no assurances have been given that he would not be extradited to the United States. It seems quite a simple way of the Australian government alleviating any sort of speculation, but they still refuse to do that. So whilst that happens, then people like David will still be concerned about his welfare, and people will be concerned about his safety.
I mean, considering the revelations of the Wikileaks cables, why do you think it is that the Australian population is just so unaware of the extent to which the United States will go to get Julian Assange and the kind of behaviour that they've been able to use on Australian citizens? Why aren't the public outraged?
I think what's happening is exactly what happened when David was in Guantanamo. They shift the focus off the war crimes, off the significant, serious human rights abuses to the personality of the individual target. This was the same line used by the US and Australian government saying, well, David was just a terrorist, so we don't care what happens to him. Now it's the same happening with Julian Assange. And I think we need to be really conscious of the fact that they're doing that to shift our attention. They're doing that specifically because they don't want us to think about all of those human beings who have been locked up without charge or trial who are innocent. They don't want us to think about those women and children who were killed by drone strikes. They don't want us to think about all of the people who have been tortured in the war on terror. You know, the US and Australian government has done a really good job of shifting our attention off those issues onto the character of Julian Assange. We can't let them do that. We need to remember the importance of the information that Wikileaks has revealed for us. It's crucial that we call for accountability for the war crimes that have been committed, for the corruption that's been exposed, that we shift our attention back onto the real issues here rather than Julian Assange's character. WikiLeaks did not go through all of that, and the whistleblowers did not go through all of that to be talking about Julian's character. This is much bigger than Julian Assange. We need to view this in the broader political context of what's happening, and we can't let them shift our attention off the serious issues at hand, and that is these human rights violations and the people who continue to suffer because of poor foreign policy and the abuse of power.
So based on what you've experienced in trying to pursue justice for David, how do you see this playing out, and which do you think would be the safest opportunity for him?
Well, the safest opportunity for Julian is one that doesn't include being anywhere in Swedish custody. So if he is in Swedish custody, it means that he could potentially be put in incommunicado detention. That's a very serious position for him to be in, and also because of the temporary surrender provisions that Sweden has with the United States. So I would hope that Sweden does send someone to Julian Assange to question him so that he can face those allegations and he can say what he needs to say to defend himself, but not in a way that puts himself at risk of being extradited to the United States. If he does end up in US custody, there is no doubt in my mind that he would be subjected to conditions that not only amount to torture, but also seriously will limit his ability to have a fair trial. It's not a conspiracy theory that they're out to get him. You know, we know that they are dying to prosecute him for something. They've been public about it, so it's not like it's a big secret. So I hope for his sake that whatever he does, that he ends up in a situation where he's protected from being in United States custody.
How can people get involved in helping the Justice campaign and your call for an inquiry into David Hicks's treatment?
What we need is to put pressure on the Australian government. They think that no one cares anymore and that we're all going to forget. So we need to let them know that torture is never okay. We need to let them know that we will remember and that we want to know, as all democratic citizens do, we want to know what the Australian government knew at the time. We want to know how much they knew about how he was being treated, and also we want to know how much political interference there was in his plea deal. We need to remember history. We need to remember that what happened to the Australians who were in Guantanamo is likely to happen again if we aren't keeping on top of this, and if we don't demand transparency around what happened to them. The fact that we're the only Western country without a Human Rights Act or, federally enshrined human rights protections should really ring some bells. The only reason why governments don't have human rights protections is because they want to breach them. So, we need to really think about that as a nation. And come together as citizens and say, no, we want these protections because we want a democratic government. We want transparency in government. We want that as citizens, and we have a right to it. And we need to have a serious look at what's going on elsewhere and how we are involved in all of that. We can't just set aside human rights principles for specific purposes because of political alliances. It's just not on.
Believe in freedom cannot rest. We believe